Before we begin this Microsoft Digital event, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work throughout Australia, as well as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing this event today. We pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate their continuing connection to land, waters and community. Our reverence also extends to all First Nation and Indigenous peoples, as well as their ancestral lands.
Hi everybody and welcome to New Breakpoint for yet another great episode. Today we've got a good show coming up on how to build Java applications on the Azure platform, which we'll get into in a moment. As always, these shows are great opportunities for you to ask any of those burning questions you might have, so please make sure that if you do have any questions that you use the Q&A window during today's episode to post those questions. If we've got longer form questions or we think there's questions that a broader audience might be interested in or that warrant a discussion, we'll keep those questions until the end to answer. Otherwise, we'll post the answer into the Q&A window that you can see on the side. If you do want to share today's video with people in your team, business or community, keep an eye on your inbox because we will send you an email in a few days with a follow-up email that gives you details on how to access the video. And as always, please do give us feedback on how you find today's show. Today's guest is Manoj from Microsoft here in Australia. He's an app dev and innovation specialist on our team who works with our customers on helping them build the next best and greatest things on the Azure platform. We're going to talk specifically about Java on Azure, and it's an interesting topic that quite a few people don't realize that the platform has deep support for the Java ecosystem, regardless of whether you're running on our platform as a service, app service style of infrastructure, or using a managed service like Azure Spring Cloud, which we co-built and operate with Pivotal. Hi Manoj, and welcome to New Breakpoint.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Look, you've got a great topic today, Java on Azure. I think it's a topic that doesn't get a huge amount of exposure, and maybe a lot of people don't realize how deep our support is for Java on the Azure platform. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're going to cover during your episode today?
Certainly, and that's exactly the position that I want to change as a part of this session. I'm going to talk about how Microsoft Azure provides a whole gamut of services that customers can choose to run their mission-critical, enterprise-grade Java applications on. I'll also touch base on how we at Microsoft internally use Java. And I'll quickly show you some demonstrations of running those Java applications on the various services that we have within Azure, whether it's on a VM or on app services or on containers, or maybe on function as a service platform like Azure Functions.
Okay, great. So I've got a Q&A that I'll be back for at the end of the show. So I'm going to hand over to you, Manoj, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you've got.
Certainly. Thanks. All right, so let's get started with let's brew Java on Azure. Now, as I said earlier, one of the reasons I wanted to do this session is to basically demonstrate the value add that Microsoft Azure brings onto the table, especially when you want to run those mission-critical Java applications on the Azure platform, and how Microsoft Azure makes it extremely simple for you to consume and deploy those Java applications on this particular platform. We'll start off by taking a look at some of the major enterprises that run their Java applications on the Azure platform. Now, there are quite a few big names here, but one of the reasons why these enterprises, like those of Adobe, chose to run Java applications on Azure is, apart from the awesome support for Java within the Microsoft ecosystem, it's also the ability to tap into some of the things that Microsoft offers in terms of using cognitive services for AI and to make the life of a developer much more easier, right from checking in code to deploying and publishing those applications on the Azure platform. So right from the very first experience of initializing an empty Git repository, throwing in some Java code, compiling them, and then doing a CI/CD on some of the Azure services, the entire experience is pretty streamlined right on the Microsoft platform. What we also talk about is the strong partner ecosystem that we have in place. So 52% of the Java developers prefer to run their mission-critical enterprise applications on Spring framework. Now, Spring makes it extremely easy to wire up enterprise-grade applications, and that's why our partnership with VMware and Pivotal makes it extremely simple for you to run those Spring Cloud applications on the Azure Spring Cloud platform. I'll show you a demonstration of that shortly. We also have some awesome integration with other vendors where we integrate with things like Redis, Elastic, Red Hat, and stuff like that. However, one of the strong reasons why customers choose to run those Java applications on Azure is the strong community engagement. Right from the 75 million plus developers using GitHub to those amazing set of people or developers who probably day in and day out use Visual Studio Code to churn out those applications. Now, whether you use Eclipse, whether you use IntelliJ or VS Code, we just have tools and plugins to make it extremely simple to work on the Azure platform. Now, you might obviously think about Microsoft as this big .NET shop. And of course, we handsomely run .NET applications on a platform. However, most of you predominantly will be surprised to see that we do have a lot of good Java applications that we use internally. We have an awesome support for running Java within Microsoft. So whether it's our acquisition of LinkedIn or for that matter, Minecraft, or whether you want to use Yammer or building Android applications, for example, you might have heard about Surface Duo. We use Java internally a lot within Microsoft. We also have our own contribution to the OpenJDK platform. In fact, that's exactly what I'm using today. So I'm using the OpenJDK provided by Microsoft, which you can download free of cost. And I'll be using that to basically build and compile those Java applications as I demonstrate their portability on the platform. Now, the obvious question is, you talked about Azure being an awesome place to run the Java applications. Let's talk about what are the different compute options in which you can choose to run your Java applications on. Now, quite obviously, you can run your Java applications on virtual machines. But as a developer, you want to stay away from that management piece. You don't want to basically go and deploy Java and update the JVM environment day in and day out. That's probably not something that you want to do. In such situations, we have capabilities where we give you a managed service. And one such managed service is the Azure Application Service or Azure App Service, or what we also call as the Azure Web Apps. Now, Azure Web Apps makes it extremely simple for deploying your applications like Spring Boot or Tomcat-based application, or for that matter, JBoss EAP-based applications that you can simply go and push. And the underlying infrastructure is completely managed by Microsoft. What you can also do is you can take advantage of things like blue-green deployments by creating deployment slots. You can integrate with things like GitHub and GitHub Actions to do a streamlined CI/CD deployment. And more importantly, you can take advantage of making your applications highly available by deploying these app services in multiple regions and then using a global load balancer, like for that matter, Azure Front Door, to redirect traffic between these two regions. If you want to go a step further and say, you know what, that's great, but I prefer containerization, there is an option where you can basically use Java containers on Azure App Services. Now, I prefer this option if you don't really care about orchestration. If you're not a Kubernetes expert or an orchestration expert, this is a great option for our customers. However, if you do have experience working with Kubernetes and containers, and if you want to stick, maybe you have some experience deploying those applications on premises or on a different cloud, and you want to translate that over to Microsoft Azure, you can take advantage of AKS. One of my favorite services, Azure Kubernetes Service. With AKS, you get a complete managed AKS Kubernetes environment. And what that Kubernetes environment will do is basically give you capabilities like native integration with different Azure services. For that matter, if you want to integrate with an ingress controller powered by Application Gateway, well, be my guest. That's all supported on the AKS environment. As I said earlier, there are plenty of customers, plenty of developers that prefer to use Spring. Spring makes it extremely simple for you to write and wire up applications. based on the Java Enterprise Edition stack. In such scenarios, if you've already used Spring Boot and you want to basically take advantage of your existing skills in Spring Cloud, well, I have good news for you. You can take advantage of what we call as the Azure Spring Cloud. Now, think of Azure Spring Cloud as this one-stop shop for deploying your microservices-based architecture. Now, technically, the Azure Spring Cloud service allows you to run things like Java 11 apps or Java 8 apps, for that matter, even .NET Core 3.1 apps. And of course, you can run containers on top of that. But what I really like about Spring Cloud is it makes orchestration very easy. It makes discovery very easy. It makes configuration very easy. We'll see an example of how to basically use Spring Cloud on Azure. But if you are coming from that Spring experience and you want to just go and build applications on Azure, which is completely full of microservices, then Spring Cloud could be one such example. There is one more service that's currently in preview that you can actually take advantage of when you're deploying your applications. When you're deploying your applications on the Azure platform. Let's say you do love containers. You're actually a big fan of containers, but you don't like the orchestration piece. You don't like the overhead that Kubernetes brings onto the table. You can take advantage of what we call as the serverless Kubernetes, and that's simply put as the Azure Container Apps. So Azure Container Apps is a great platform where I just want to go and define my applications in containers, bind them in containers, and then just allow the containerization platform, which is in this case, the Azure Container Apps, to scale the apps up and down without me creating deployments and ingress controllers and replicas and pods and stuff like that. It just handles all that stuff for me. And the North Star for most customers is, I don't want to manage containers. I don't want to manage the infrastructure. You know what? I have an application that retrieves an image from a blob and applies a grayscale effect on top of that. So in such scenarios, if you want to build event-driven applications that are kind of glue between different components of your software ecosystem, then you can take advantage of our function as a service platform or Azure Functions. We talked a lot of services here. We talked about virtual machines. We talked about AKS. We talked about Azure Functions and app services. And you might also see that we do support Red Hat OpenShift as well. Of course, if you want to bring those containerized-based applications on ARO, be my guest. Now, it's time for us to see all of these stuff in action. So here we are on the Azure portal, the ever popular experience of blades and journeys that you get on the Azure portal. Now, even before I get started with the Azure portal, I just want to make sure that I do have what we call as the JDK installed on my machine. Now, this obviously is a Windows machine, and I've already installed the Open JDK provided by Microsoft. You can simply go to your favorite search engine and search for OpenJDK Microsoft. It will take you to a download page. We do have versions 11 and 17 right now available for download. So if I navigate to my PowerShell console here, if I run Java-version, and I also see the compiler version, which is in this case Java, you will see that I'm currently running both the JDK and the Java compiler version of 11.0.14. Okay. Now, of course, you can deploy applications that are running on .17 as well. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we'll be focused on purely the Java 11 version. First thing first, yes, you could create a virtual machine, install the Java JDK and the runtime on top of that and start deploying applications. But as I said earlier, most developers prefer to have a managed experience. And one such experience that you get on the platform is the Azure App Service platform. Now, I already have an Azure App Service available, but I just want to show you the experience that you will get by creating that. So if you click on Create a Resource, you will navigate to this particular section where you can create a web app. I can see here. And the moment you click on Create, you can choose the resource group, which is basically a container to house all your resources. I'll choose one of the existing resource groups that I have. I need to give it a name, but here is something very interesting. Right here inside this particular drop-down where we choose the runtime stack, you can see that we do have Java 11 and Java 8. Now, as I choose one of these versions, you can then see that we do support things like JBoss EAP 7, Tomcat 9.0, Tomcat 8.5, and of course, the Java Embedded Web Server as well, which is the standard edition. So in this case, I can just choose the standard edition and it will create a web app for me, which I've already done. So if I navigate back to my resource group, and if I just click on OK here, you'll see that inside this resource group called Let's Java on Azure resource group, quite an interesting name, you'll see that I do have one of the app services called Let's Brew Java on AC. So as I said earlier, you can now take advantage of this managed platform to build your highly available applications. So you can take advantage of blue-green deployments using deployment slots and stuff like that. You can inject your environment variables, your configuration data in configuration. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm actually using IntelliJ. Now, when you start using IntelliJ, if you navigate to the settings wizard here, you will notice that one thing you can do is navigate to the plugin section, which is right here. And you'll see that I have already installed the Microsoft tools here. Now, if you're not sure of how to install this, it's pretty straightforward. If you can go to File, I can just show you an easier method. So let me go and close this project. And right here, if I go back to IntelliJ, you can go to Plugins. And in the marketplace, you can search for Azure. To pop up the Azure toolkit for IntelliJ. And what this toolkit will do is it will make your life extremely simple to work with Azure services, including deployment to some of the Azure services we talked about earlier, like Azure Spring Cloud or Azure App Services or Azure Functions. In this case, we're talking about Azure App Services. So let me navigate back to projects. I've already installed this. It'll probably ask you for a restart of that. And let's navigate to new project. So this will now launch the new project experience that we have within IntelliJ. And notice that here I can choose a Spring Initializer template. So in this case, let me call this Let's Coffee on Azure, for lack of anything interesting. And I can choose my default templates. In this case, I'm going to build this on Java 11. Notice that Java 11 was one of the supported versions on the Azure App Service platform. My deployment packaging is going to be based on jar. I'll hit next. And then I can choose the Spring Initializer to create or bootstrap a Spring Web MVC application. In this case, I'll choose Web and then choose to use the Spring Web option here. So let me click here and then select this web application and hit finish. So what this basically will do is bootstrap that web application for me. And then I can start adding my REST controllers, my HTML static pages, just build your web application as you would normally do. Once you're done by adding those applications, the next step essentially is to take this application and deploy this on Azure. Then one of the easiest way to do so would be to take this application, and once you have this plugin on the project, right click here, choose the Azure section here, and notice now you get this amazing option to deploy this application on multiple Azure services, whether it's Spring Cloud, whether it's to Azure Web Apps, or to add Docker support to containerize that particular application so that you can push it to AKS or ACI or even to Azure Container Apps. All right. So in this case, I will right click this application, go to Azure, and then choose to deploy this into Azure Web Apps. Now, it's going to authenticate first using your existing Azure CLI credentials. Of course, you can use device login or you can use service principal as well. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to use the Azure CLI experience. I'll click on sign in. And what this basically will do is it will sign in to Microsoft Azure. Once that is done, it's going to prompt me to choose which subscription do I want to deploy these resources into. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll use my internal subscription that I have, which is the one which is selected, and I'll click select. All right, that's done. Now, here's something interesting. This wizard will also allow you to create an app service using this particular portal. So I will probably go and click on this plus sign and notice that it also allows me to create that entire web app, something that we did earlier using the Azure portal. You can do this within the Azure IntelliJ experience that you get as a part of the JetBrains toolkit. So I can create a web app instance. I can choose my hosting plans. And once I'm done with that, I can choose which platform I want to deploy this into. So in this case, this could be a standard Java 11 SE environment, but we saw some of the other examples here in the portal as well. So by choosing that, you can basically say that, hey, I want to deploy this as a Java 11 SE application on the Azure App Service platform. Now, if you choose to select more settings right here, you can actually go and customize some of these fundamental things behind app services. For example, you can choose the hosting plan. So whether you want to use the standard plan, the basic plan, the free plan, or the premium plans that we have within our kitty, you can choose those options here. One way is to basically go and code your web application using IntelliJ and publish it using the publish wizard that you just saw me using. Alternatively, you can actually go to this Azure Explorer section here, and you can notice that once I've logged in, you'll see all your Azure resources right here. So I can actually go and create a Redis cache from here. I can go and create a function app from here. I can go and create a storage account from here. So this is the alternate way of a deployment experience that you get within the IntelliJ portfolio. I've already deployed an application here. So let me actually go to close project here, and I'll choose the other application that we use and we've already deployed. So this application is a simple to-do MVC application. As you can see here, there's a to-do controller, and this to-do controller has a post mapping on /, which is the default root here. And I've just used JPA, the Spring JPA package to basically provide me that Java persistent API. If I go and just run this package, so let me actually first go and see if I'm running this as a demo application. So let's run this here. Now, once it basically bootstraps that application and is available, so I can see that this application is getting started. I'll just close this to make it much more easier for you to see the output. And once this application bootstraps and is running, we can then basically go and send some requests to it. So this is now going and deploying that application, which I just updated. Because right now you're using the Azure Web App Demo configuration, which basically means that whatever jar file you got, just go ahead and publish this to the Azure Web App portal. You can see that my deployment was successful, and this is the URL that we see here. Okay, so if I now navigate to this URL, you will see that what we get here is an empty list. And one of the reasons for that is because I'm doing something which you should never do in production, and that is in my application properties, I've just set the value of the JPA Hibernate to create and drop. Now that's something that you would typically don't want to do in a production scenario. All right. So now if I go back to my generated request, you can actually send your REST request directly within IntelliJ. And one such way is to basically use this post method that I've used here. So if you just click on this, this will actually send that post request, and you will see that now this particular request has been successfully completed, which means if I go back to my web application and do a refresh, you will see that that ID was posted inside that particular database. Interestingly enough, this data is being stored within an Azure Postgres DB database. So you have hooked up an Azure Postgres database, and you've used the Spring JPA framework to persist that particular data within that Azure Postgres database. As I said earlier, we basically give you the best of both platforms. You get the ability to run your applications on app services, and then it makes it extremely simple for you to take those applications and interact with a backend database like the PostgreSQL database. So that's one option of deploying an application on Azure using the Azure Web Apps. Let's take a step back and think of this from more of a microservices perspective. This is great for running web applications, and it allows you to scale anywhere between 0 to 40 instances. If you go with app service environments, you can actually scale to 200 instances, which is great and kind of sufficient for most of the customers. But what it basically does behind the scenes is takes your application and deploys it to every instance that you have within your app service plan. Now, let's say you want to build a microservices architecture and you've already used things like Spring Cloud on premises or maybe on the cloud version of the vendor. You can take advantage of the similar experience that you have working with microservices and the Spring environment and bring it on Azure. And one such way is by using the Azure Spring Cloud experience. I'll show you how simple it is to get started with Spring Cloud. Let's navigate back to our portal. And if I just search for Azure Spring Cloud, you'll see that that pops up here. And what this allows me to do is it creates a bootstrapped, completely managed Spring environment for me, a Spring Cloud environment that includes the discovery agents, it includes the configuration gateway, and all the meats that you need in order to run an effective application. You'll see that the standard experience of blades and journeys here. I'll choose one of my resource groups here and give it a name. This name, by the way, has to be globally unique across all the Azure tenants. So let me just put something interesting here. And then I'll choose the region. In this case is Australia East. I can make this particular Spring Cloud zone aware. When I say zone aware, I'm talking about availability zone aware. Okay. In this case, I'll choose it to ignore. But this is where things get really interesting. You have two options to choose within the Spring Cloud platform. One is basic. Now, this is a fantastic way if you just getting your feet wet with the Azure Spring Cloud service. For example, you're just starting off, trying to explore. This is a great platform and great plan to get started with. But if you're building anything remotely production, then you obviously will choose the production or the standard plan. Now, here, notice that you can have up to 500 instances. That's just amazing because think of the amount of scale that you're bringing with Spring Cloud on our platform, right? It gives you the average cost that it'll cost me about $1,200. And now it also allows me to see the SLA here. But what I really like about this concept of a standard plan, though, is the fact that I get custom domains, I get VNet integration, and my favorite, the blue-green deployment as well. What I've done is once you're done with this, you select a plan, and then you can just go and choose next, 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 and then review and create, and this will kickstart the Spring Cloud experience for you. Okay. Let me close this because what I've done to save time, though, is already created a Spring Cloud environment. Now, this is again based on the standard plan. Now, what you'll see here is in this particular settings pane, you see the applications. So this is the apps that you're going to deploy on the Spring Cloud. As I said earlier, Spring Cloud supports Java 11, Java 8, .NET Core 3.1, or containers as applications. You can define your config server. Now, this is where I feel that most customers tend to go wrong with. You should never put configuration within your application code. They should be separate. They should be stored in some other place. So this basically injects that configuration as a service within Spring Cloud. So maybe you want to store this into a private GitHub repository that your Spring Cloud can tap into. So notice that here in my config server, I've actually configured it to look into one of my GitHub repositories. And the branch that I'm interested in is the main branch. And I've just used the HTTP authentication here. You can basically choose other authentication mechanisms as well. Now, inside the networking section, it shows you what are the outbound IP addresses that this particular service is going to be using. And it also allows you to deploy Spring Cloud and connect to resources inside VNet as well. Okay. But right now, interestingly enough, I do not have any applications deployed within my Spring Cloud environment. So let's fix that first. If you notice in the previous environment, we created that application. So let me actually close this project and let's navigate back to this Let's Coffee on Azure. I think we just deployed a very simple Spring Boot web application. We haven't actually created any controllers or REST methods as such. So let me navigate to projects. And if I navigate to the source here, let's go to main and let's go to Java and let's go to this Let's Coffee on Azure application. Right now, we do not have any path mappings. We do not have any controllers here, but I'm just going to make a very simple controller. I'm going to come back here and paste this get mapping. Notice that here it's giving me an error. So I'll hit the Alt Enter key and that should basically go and import the necessary class. That's the same thing I'm going to do for request parameters. And I also need to annotate this particular class as a REST controller. Right click this application right here, and I can then go and choose to deploy this to the Azure Spring Cloud. Notice that it automatically connects to my Azure service because I've already signed in. It detects that this is a service that we have already in place, and I can choose to deploy this as an app. So let me click on this plus symbol here, and let's call this Let's Coffee V1. I can go to more settings. And I can choose to enable the public endpoint for this application. What this basically allows me to is set a publicly addressable endpoint that I can connect to. I can choose which version of Java I want to use. In this case, that's Java 11. Let's click on OK and click on Run. Now, what is this doing behind the scenes? It's using the Spring Cloud extension and the Azure plugins to basically go run this application, bootstrap that application, and deploy this on the Azure platform. All right, looks like the deployment was successfully created. So if I navigate back to the Azure portal and let's click on App and refresh this, you will see that it should create an application called Let's Copy V1. That's what we named our application as. It's successfully deployed. There is one running instance of this. If I navigate to the copy application, you'll see that it also has an endpoint assigned to it. So if I copy this here and navigate to this URL and enter, this will now give me the standard Spring Boot error because we haven't got to the right path. So if I come back here and type in hello, you see that we get hello world. And what I'm actually going to do is go back to my code and just make a few changes. Let's say this is hello. This is a green deployment. Okay. For lack of anything interesting. Of course, then I'm going to go and build the package here. So let me hit Control C and let's use the Maven package to create package. And I'm just going to say that let's skip the test here. Now this is going and building the particular package for me. And if I do a quick ls here, you'll see that one of the options that we have is target. If I go to target and do an ls, you'll see that we do have the updated jar file here that I can use to deploy. All right, let me clear the screen. Let's go back to the previous directory, the home directory of our application. And what I'm going to do is run the second command, which allows me to create a new deployment. So this is the command basically. We're using the advantage of a Spring Cloud deployment. So I need to specify the name of the deployment. I also need to provide which application I want to create the deployment against. I'm specifying the resource group name, the Azure Spring Cloud service. They're specifying the artifact path or the jar path file. And I'm also specifying that the runtime version is Java_11. With that thing done, let's hit enter. And this will take some time for it to create that deployment. And once that is done, we will see that now we have two deployments within that particular application. One will be marked as production. The other one will be marked as staging. And then, of course, you can choose to fluctuate between the two. So maybe you want to make new changes to the staging environment, make sure it's up and running before you flip it over to the production environment. I'm just going to give this a couple of minutes as it runs. As you can see, friends, the deployment has successfully completed, and we can see that the provisioning state is succeeded. Now, if you do want to check the logs of your deployments, you can actually use a command that you can just run using the AZ Spring Cloud app logs command. I need to provide the name of the application. I also need to provide it the deployment name that I just used. This is the resource group name as well as the Spring Cloud service. And if I hit enter, you'll see the logs or the tail logs of the deployment. And we can see that it's already listening. The Tomcat service also has successfully started, which actually is good news. All right, let's navigate back to our portal and I'm going to click on refresh. And you can see now that we have one of one staging environment. Let's click on staging here. And again, notice that this time we are using the /green, which is our deployment here. And I can say this as hello. And this time you'll see that the application says, hello, this is a green deployment. One very useful resource that you can use to kickstart your journey of learning Java on Azure and see what are the options that Azure has to offer is to just search for Java on Azure on the Microsoft Learn platform. Now, this will take you to this 8-module section, which gives you a complete overview of the entire ecosystem of services that we have on the Microsoft platform. to run Java applications. So it talks about how we internally use Java. It talks about what are the services we use and what services you can deploy on top of that. So it gives an example of deploying a Spring Boot application on the Azure App Service using the CLI or the command line interface. Similarly, it talks about how do you deploy Spring microservices. Also kind of covers things like the gateway. And finally, it talks about the function as a service platform, which is Azure Functions, and uses things like event-driven programming models and allowing the data to be stored in a NoSQL database like Cosmos DB.
Manoj, excellent session there. Really learned a lot about how to build and deploy Java solutions on the Azure platform. I can see you've got the Microsoft learning path there for Java on Azure. Highly recommend it, like you said, if you want to understand a bit more how to work with Java on Azure. A couple of common questions I think we can probably answer here and now before we get to the live Q&A. Microsoft now has its own release of the OpenJDK, the Microsoft build of the OpenJDK. Sometimes people think that that's what you have to use to build and deploy Java apps onto the Azure platform. Is that the case?
No, that's actually a good question, and definitely that's not the case. You can use any OpenJDK version or Java runtime versions that you want to use for building and running your applications. They just work fine on the Microsoft platform.
Yep. That's what I was hoping the answer was. I just wanted to clarify that. And then the second one is you've obviously shown how to work with a fairly popular Java developer IDE during the session today, and you've done those deployments using extensions or plugins deployed into that IDE. Typically in a larger organization, you wouldn't see many people doing that right-click deploy into a hosted environment like Azure. So are there other options for people to deploy their Java applications into Azure that don't involve using the desktop app?
Yeah, certainly. Again, a great question, Simon. So there are a couple of options that we as Microsoft provide. One is, of course, you can take advantage of Azure DevOps and its pipeline capabilities to go and build your code and deploy them as artifacts on the services that we saw during this particular session. That's perfectly fine. You can also tap into GitHub Actions and workflows to basically go and use those to build your artifacts and deploy them on the Azure platform. Now, that does not mean that you basically have to kind of completely get rid of what you're currently using. Maybe you have a Jenkins master and slave model currently in place to deploy your applications. We do provide plugins in place to go ahead and do that as well. We also have capabilities that we integrate with other CI/CD services via plugins and services that you can tap into. And then you can use those to provide or deploy applications on the platform. I'm certainly not in favor of using this right-click.
I again, appreciate the session. Please, if you're watching, hang around. We're going to hop onto the live Q&A now. Manoj is going to be joining us to take live questions from today's session. Manoj, thanks again for joining us today, and I'll see you in a moment.
Thank you so much, Simon. Thanks for having me.